Hey everyone, welcome to this amazing panel. I'm so excited to be joined with these fantastic sci fi authors who have also so gladly helped me come up with the title. I never would have come up with such a fun title on my own. So I'm glad that I got the professionals to come and help. I'm just going to do a quick intro about myself, and then I'll let the panelists introduce themselves and the books. Also, if anyone has any questions, feel free to pop them in the chat and I will come back to them at the end. So if you didn't know who I am, my name's Lily, and I am the book reviewer behind Utopia's State of Mind. So now the authors will introduce themselves, and we'll start with Sylvia.
Hi, I'm really glad to be here. My name is Sylvia Liu, and I'm a middle grade author. And my most recent book is Hannah Shue and the Ghost Crab Nation. It's a middle grade sci-fi where the premise is when kids turn 13, they get their brains connected to the multi-web. And the main character, Hannah Shue, is a 12-year-old who discovers a corporate conspiracy against her class of kids that are about to get connected. And so it's kind of a fun adventure mystery thriller.
Hiya, I am Kate Dillon, very well prepared to put the book right behind me. I am the author of Mindwalker, which, yes, I'm not reversed. It's the other way around, but it's the pink one. You really can't miss it. And it is a cyberpunk thriller, Marvel-esque book that's about a girl with a supercomputer in her brain who can take over other people's minds. And there are conspiracies and there are rebel factions and there's all the good stuff you love in a cyberpunk novel. And it feels like watching a Marvel movie.
Hi, I'm Claire Wynn. I also write young adult science fiction. My first duology is concluding in like 3 days. This is the sequel to City of Shattered Light. The first book we pitched as Guardians of the Galaxy meets Escape from New York. It's about an heiress who falls in with a group of smugglers and they get trapped in this outlaw planet that is subject to a tech quarantine and have to escape a malicious artificial intelligence that's chasing them all.
Hi, I'm Serena Strauss, and I write young adult and adult science fiction. And my most recent novel is Reinception. Sorry, it's blurring out there. So this is the first in a trilogy, and it takes place 100 years in the future where we have the technology to eliminate unwanted human behaviors, everything from overeating to eliminating the most vicious human behaviors and criminal impulses. And a 20-year-old college student is struggling with her decision about whether or not to change her mind when her boyfriend is forcibly reprogrammed, and she teams up with a government-alleged terrorist to uncover the truth about reinception.
These all sound amazing. I've read most of them, so I'm so excited to be here. Thanks for having us, Lily. I'm the author of science fiction and speculative work, adult, middle grade, and YA and comic books. And I think I'm mostly here because of Rise of the Red Hand. And it is the book one of a duology. The second book is coming out April 25th or 6th next year. And that's going to be called Fall of the Iron Gods, Rise and Fall. They match. It's a magic pair. And this book is about, in similar themes as we could see, the street rat turned revolutionary and the disillusioned politician's son, join forces to take down a technocratic government that is building its utopia on the backs of its poorest people. It's set in a future South Asia that's been ravaged by climate change and deals with AI, algorithms, and all these other gnarly things that we are currently dealing with and that people aren't regulating enough yet. And I'm very worried about. Sci-fi is about anxiety, isn't it? Like, that's what we have to do. I also have been lucky to be in a bunch of really cool anthologies recently. The Gathering Dark, I wrote a horror story, which scared me to write, which didn't turn out to be that scary, but I'm just a big chicken. Magic Has No Borders. This comes out next Tuesday, and I'm really excited about this anthology, but also my story is a time traveling historical story, which is super weird and cool and sci-fi. And I was lucky to have that chance to write that. And then I'm super stoked. I got a story coming out in the Star Wars from a certain point of view, Return of the Jedi anthology that's coming out in August this year. I can't tell you what character I got to write, but it's like a big lifetime achievement just to get to write in that universe. So that's a little bit about me, and I'm super happy to be here and talk with you fabulous people about the future.
Yes, thank you so much for also that segue, because I was also made aware that I never actually said the name of the panel, which is The Future is Here, Cyberpunk, AI, and Augmented Future and Stories. I want to start off with one that maybe everyone expected that I would ask, which was just what draws you to sci-fi and what was your journey with it growing up? Because I know that it's not the same for everyone. So Sylvia, do you want to start?
Sure. I mean, sci-fi has just been always my favorite genre growing up. I grew up in South America in Caracas, Venezuela, and my prime, like preteen and teen reading years were in the 80s. And so my only access to American or US sci-fi was a used bookstore by expats. So I basically grew up reading really old, like white male sci-fi, like Foundation, Dune, Edgar Rice Burroughs, Isaac Asimov. And so, but even then, I still just like loved it all. And as I grew up and became an adult, it just became like that's just sort of my comfort read. And so I've loved how diverse it's gotten. And nowadays, there's like N.K. Jemisin and Charlie Jane Anders, and then even in the kidlit space now, there's a lot of very cool, especially middle grade and YA sci-fi. So it's just been something I've loved since I was a kid.
For me, I actually got into video games first before I was getting into like sci-fi literature and all of that. I really loved the Metroid series as a kid. That was my first time seeing like a female lead in an action adventure series. And I actually, one of the reasons I started writing in my teens was because I was really angry that the video game Other M, which was a Metroid installment that I felt did Samus Aran really dirty as a character. And I felt this is really sexist. I could do better and I want to write better protagonists. So video games have really influenced my writing style in general. And yeah, I've always loved that about sci-fi.
I think for me, it was a lot of TV growing up. I used to love all the serials. Like, they used to show TV one episode a week back then. Or as I saw someone on the internet call it, the Disney model. And then I spontaneously turned to dust because I'm like, that is not the Disney model. That is the TV model. That is the model. But like it was a show and it was an event every week. You tuned into your favorite shows. And all of mine were basically sci-fi. It was Dark Angel. It was Dollhouse. It was Alias to some extent, which was kind of spies and espionage and just really cool tech. And they were always my favorite, even though they weren't the only things I would watch. And couple that with the fact that my dad is a huge sci-fi fan. So growing up, I would just kind of take whatever was on his shelf, which really was, very similar. It was just a lot of older sci-fi with male protagonists, kind of very much what we think sci-fi is, but it wasn't at all like the TV shows that I was watching, which were far more diverse and far more fun and far less science heavy. And I guess when I kind of started writing, I was writing both fantasy and kind of dabbling in sci-fi. But when I moved into sci-fi, I knew that I wanted to do the fun sci-fi. I wanted to do the TV sci-fi. I didn't want to do the real sci-fi because science is hard and you have to fact check it. And I don't really have time for that because it's really, really hard. And I just want to, blow stuff up and melt people. So that's the kind of sci-fi that I write. And I have a really good time doing it.
Yes, so for me, I actually I hope my brother's watching this because it's all your fault, Ari. I'm a little sister, so my brother got to. Somebody mentioned it before. It used to be one show, right? And my brother, he's older, so he got to pick what we watched. And all the stuff that's really popular now, like X-Men, Dungeons and Dragons, stuff like that. It was not cool at all when I was a kid, and that is everything that he was into. He was really into like Hulk and the Bionic Man and Star Trek. He loved watching stuff like Godzilla, and it was like black and white reruns, stuff like that. So that's what he watched. So that's what I watched. He was really into like Lord of the Rings. So I was forced to watch those things, and I didn't really love them at the time, but I got into them because that's what he was into. And I remember when we were kids, like playing Bionic Man and Star Trek and stuff like that, like running around the neighborhood, and you would like run really slow to look like you were running fast and things like that. And then the first book that I remember personally loving that was science fiction was The Martian Chronicles by Ray Bradbury. So that was the first science fiction that I loved. And then from there, that was the genre that I loved to read. And the first book that I wrote and published was actually true crime. It was a true crime memoir. I'm a lawyer by training. I was a prosecutor. And when I moved into fiction, I tried writing crime novels, and I just didn't enjoy it at all. It seemed like the natural progression. I wrote it, I kind of forced it out, and I didn't enjoy it. And I was like, why am I trying to write what I don't read? And then I started writing science fiction. I'm like, why don't I write what I love to read? And that's what got me into writing science fiction. And that's what I've been doing ever since.
So I relate to everybody here in so many ways. I feel like, what do you do with a child who has an overactive imagination? Try to get them something to do that allows them to explore all those different possibilities. And I feel like as a kid, I was the same way. I was just into anything. I loved Star Trek, Star Wars, Lord of the Rings. I got into comic books really young. I watched all the shows that everyone watched too. And I just felt like the thing that I was probably getting from it, and I only realize now what it was the idea of like potential futures, like the idea that you could, I think existence is really heavy. And if you start thinking about how long we might all have, we won't see these futures, but we can write about them, and we can imagine the idea of what it is going to be like in 100 years. We could imagine solutions to the future. We could imagine, I'm a super science nerd too. So I do like to, I was talking to a physicist last week and an astrophysicist and a solar physicist. I'm really lucky to live in a town where the university is like really accessible. And I used to teach there for a long time. So I will nerd out for a very long time over the core of science. Whether or not it makes it into the book, that's a different thing. But I really enjoy the exploration and also processing like human anxiety through writing about interesting, whether it's just blowing stuff up or chasing or whatever. But the setting is interesting, right? We're all making ethical questions and questions about society, belonging, being with and without things, access and technology and the balance between it. And I find it very fascinating that authors who usually are writing, I mean, it's not true across the board, but I think that a lot of writers who deal with technology and specifically cyberpunk, but mostly technology, are actually really anxious about technology, and that's why we're writing about it. It's not like I'm downloading Alexa. I will never have Alexa in my house. I know what she's doing. She's listening to everything. So it's funny. Like I love an analog life. Like I'm a big gardener. I'm a big like survivalist and all these things. But I write about this future because it worries me and it helps me process this anxiety about what are we doing? Why are we not regulating AI?
Once again, with the amazing segues to the next question that I want to be asking, which is that one of our subtitles is Augmented Futures. And I think that as we've all kind of talked a little bit about, the potential of sci-fi, the imagination of sci-fi is what draws a lot of us to that genre. So I wanted to ask, what do you see in the future of science fiction, and or conversations that need to be had, within the genre? So Olivia, do you want to start us off?
Yeah, I feel very nervous about how little we've learned, and like we know so much today, but for some reason, um, regulation of really important things like AI, it's just not happening. Chat GPT, all these things are just happening in this free kind of way, and I really am worried about that. And not in the sense that I think AI is actually intelligent. I feel like that is the biggest misnomer of the century. AI is not intelligent at all. I don't believe we will have artificial intelligence. I mean, that's still very, very theoretical. But the idea that people are behind the technology, and if we don't regulate the humans and the industries and the governments that are going to utilize these technologies, we will pay the price for how they impact us. And I don't believe technology will save the planet. I don't believe that this is the way. I believe that industries profit from all of this. I don't believe we do. In fact, like Bitcoin mines, what's really happening there? I'm really angry about this because there's so much waste of energy for what, and I feel like we should be really angry and worried and not just let it go. We should be asking a lot of questions about regulation because if we don't now, it'll be too late. So sorry for my soapbox. It stresses me out though. It really does. So.
Go ahead, Kate.
Oh no. Oh, thanks. Yeah, I think it's really interesting because the law moves slowly, and we've reached a point in history where technology moves really fast. And so by the time lawmakers even figure out what it is that we are talking about, it's already everywhere, and it's almost a Pandora's box, which you can't really close anymore, which is the really worrying thing. And I remember part of this is like, it's really interesting because in the Mindwalker world, something that I do is it gets to the point where the technology companies have realized this, and everything has to be developed in secret because now the companies are wielding power and they are using the law to stop other technologies so that they can catch up. So there is it's kind of imagining a future where at the very least capitalism has figured out that technology is moving faster than law. And of course, instead of doing something good with that knowledge, they're just like, how can we slow things down so that we can make money? Which is an equally problematic thing, of course. But I just remember once watching a show called Timeless. I'm not sure if you guys have watched it. It's the one where I think Nick Lachey from the boy band goes back in time to travel with the woman who used to be in Suits, which is my pitch for this show, which is a horrible pitch. But it's just, they have a time machine, and the whole premise of the show is that, there's a bad guy and he's got a time machine and he's going back in time to try and kill, important figures and change the future. And I sat there one day and I was just like, sometimes we're fretting about all of this stuff, but really what really worries me is the technology we don't know about and the people who have access to it. And I can't help but just sit here one day and go, somebody could have a time machine. And right now they're off trying to screw with the future. And there's absolutely nothing the average person can do because we don't know that they have a time machine. And once you get into that thought process, it's really kind of hard to claw your way out. So now you get to all share in my anxiety.
I think part of what's interesting about a lot of these discussions, and it's a lot of what I explore in my book, and I guess some of this is my legal background, but it seems like a lot of what we're all talking about is there's a limit to how much you can legislate for these things. And I think one problem is that the law is slow and the law can't keep up with technology. But I also think part of the problem is that you can't legislate for everything. And the law is not a precision instrument. So you can have blanket laws to try to deal with certain issues and try to anticipate things, but you're always going to have unintended consequences, right? So you're going to have unintended consequences of technology, whether it's pros or cons, and you're going to have unintended consequences of laws, whether it's for the pro or the con. So there's a limited amount you can do to protect people from their own inventions and to protect people with their own laws. So I think that that's a really interesting thing to explore when we're exploring science fiction and we're exploring how we can kind of deal with deal with our own advances. And when we're talking about things like technology, so we're already dealing with an augmented future, right? Whether we're dealing with external technology like like our smartphones or Google Glasses or something like a cochlear implant, right? What a wonderful thing. It can help a deaf person hear. And I think when we're talking about advances in technology like that, things that are going to help people who can't hear, or people who can't see, or people who are paralyzed be able to walk, those are things that are going to be life altering in really positive ways. But then, of course, a lot of what we're also exploring is how these things are going to be life altering in terrible ways. And I think that's also what is really interesting about science fiction. And I find it fascinating when we read each other's books. And this is something Sylvia and I have talked about a lot offline, is how much what we predict overlaps. And that's no coincidence, right? A lot of these things are going to happen, and it's a lot of what we're thinking about and terrified of, is all the good and all the bad that come with these things, and the limit to what we can stop and what we can do about it.
Yes, Serena, you basically said what I was going to say, which is we already live in an augmented future. We've already have things like as we grow older, we get lenses for, cataracts, and we replace hips. And, it's not a big step to add cybernetics to it. All of a sudden, they're already technology where you can use your mind to control prosthetic limbs and things like that. And so I think the question as like writers and writing sci-fi and just like extrapolating that one extra step is like, as you said, what are the costs and benefits to society? Are we making people's lives easier? But also, like, one of the things I think Cyberpunk really talks about is how it exacerbates existing inequalities, right? Because the people with access to this technology, they can continue, whereas the people, who currently aren't online are really left behind. That's just like a very simple, thing.
I think you guys have covered a lot of what I was going to say here, but obviously artificial intelligence is huge, and the lack of regulations therein is also a big thing. And I think it's even worse in the US because we're even lacking the kind of laws that protect our security online. And data privacy is a huge thing, especially because technology becomes increasingly more integrated with our lives, and it's to the point where we can't go about our daily lives or interact with the rest of society without it. And this is a problem when it's in the hands of big companies who can sell our information, do what they will with it, and we don't have meaningful legislation yet to stop that or regulate how it's used. And we also have a lot of artificial intelligence is the other, obviously, Pandora's box, like Kate mentioned. There is so much that is happening, and it's out there, and it's ubiquitous. So by the time legislators even get a hold of it, it gets to the point where they can't really meaningfully stop it with legislation because it's already happened. All of this creative work has already been scraped. And there are some lawsuits coming out right now about the use of music and copyrighted works and the likenesses and voices of celebrities. But you think about how far is that really going to go when everyone already has access to it. And we have artificial intelligence doing amazing things like drug discovery, new biomarkers, data analysis, other things that are drudgery in human lives. But instead, we also have tech bros coming out and saying, hey, we're going to automate art and literature in a really unethical way by using existing art. And some people are like, oh, it's intelligent, it's thinking. No, it's not. We are so far away from that. We are so far away from human reasoning in AI form. It is just regurgitating what people have already created by this point. So yes, legislation, I think, is the absolute biggest piece right now. And we kind of need to get ahead of ourselves with that if we want to control the spread and use of what AI is going to do in the future.
So I have a few questions that I want to ask that like pair books together. I want to start by saying the first one that I have is that both Reinception and Hanatsu and the Ghost Crab Nation tackle corporations and their roles in the future. I was wondering if both of you could talk about what draws you to that theme and if you have any other sci-fi books with similar themes that you would recommend. I don't know who wants to start this.
I mean, I guess I can go. I don't know that I was like particularly drawn to the evil corporation thing. I used to work in big pharma, which a lot of people think is evil corporation. I don't know that I necessarily agree. I guess there's always pros and cons to big corporations. Um, but I just think it in the context of this book and a technology that has the power to change human behavior, the the big corporation and the evil behind the corporation made sense for the plot. Um, but I do think there are so many good books and stories and movies out there that feature the theme of the evil corporation that I love the question, and I kind of could have gone like on and on and on for days about like great examples of it. But some of the ones I came up with are Ready Player One is obviously a great recent one. Dune is a classic. The Maze Runner, The Terminator, of course, is a great one for this panel. Jurassic Park. I don't know if people think of Jurassic Park as an evil corporation movie, but it really is. The Divergent series. I was trying to remember the name of the corporation in Wall-E, but that's a really good one too. But like Total Evil Corporation. But those were just like a few that came to mind. There's so many of them, but just off the top of my head.
Yeah, for me, like impartial answer to your question of what drew me to this is that, I've always been interested in politics and just if you look at like current society, how it's set up, the industrial capitalist society, it tends to concentrate power into corporations. And a lot of like our political systems try to deal with that, but we kind of just see it in, all sorts of systems, whether, they're the oligarchic socialist systems or, the capitalist, like democratic systems we have, we see this concentration of corporate power. And it like, I guess, my going back to the very first question, like my favorite movie ever was the original Blade Runner. And, that's like the classic cyberpunk, like story of, like a corporate run society, which, I don't think is so far from the truth, actually, when you like look at who has the levers of power in our society. But yeah, I agree. Like there's a lot of great current stories, like, in the YA space, like Marie Lu writes a lot of interesting stories. There's Ready Player One. In the adult space, one of my favorite recent stories was called Blackfish City by Sam Miller. And I just really love that because it's got this environmental themes, which I also, like Olivia, very concerned about global warming and, how we're not really dealing with that. So, and again, it's because like, we see a lot of this discussion going again, back to like AI and stuff is like like a lot of our society is geared towards like, like making money or producing units instead of like maximizing human endeavors, right? Like art and creativity. And so that's what I think is the danger of the corporate, like mentality. So anyway, that's what drew me to that.
I want to talk about in Rise of the Red Hand and City of Shattered Light / City of Vicious Night. I think one of the things you both examine are kind of characters who are on the periphery of society, whether it be like an underground revolutionary or underground outlaws, there's people who aren't necessarily like within taking into, how do I describe this? I'm just going to leave it as what I said, actually, because I don't think I can, I don't have a better way to describe it. But I think that role, when I was reading your books, was one that I think is really explored in sci-fi, like characters who are not necessarily forefront. And so I'd love to know what your thoughts were and your choices in regards to your main characters or your side characters and their backstories, like creating kind of that part of the world. Yeah.
Okay, so one thing that drew me to writing the city is the one of the basic aspects of the world building for Requiem, this main outlaw city, is that there is a lot of corporate exploitation happening because Alpha Centauri, the star system that has recently been settled by the time the book happens, it has fewer ethics laws surrounding human experimentation. So there are a lot of corporate players preying on this city, and there's this outlaw matriarchy in place that kind of strives to prevent this kind of thing from happening, but there's still bad actors and powerful entities operating and trying to get their hooks in this city. So I really like writing outlaw characters in general, partially because I don't really like where the state of politics and current legislation is going. And there is definitely an appeal to writing outlaw characters when you see current law enforcement and oversight and legislation creating laws that actively harm people of certain groups. Like in the US, it is not a stretch to say that queer people and women and lots of minority groups are actively under attack by current legislation. And it's definitely, I want to write stories about characters who are, fighting back against those kind of powerful entities. And part of Asa's journey in both of the books is about her learning that the world she came from is not just populated by people who have earned their fortunes through intelligence and hard work. There are a lot of people in the tech royalty scene who have built themselves by exploiting other people. And this is something she has to contend with a little bit more in book 2. I think it's a very important theme in current times because we have the legislation and the corporate exploitation, and we see increasing corporate profits right now while wages for normal people are stagnating. So yeah, that's the appeal for writing underdog outlaw characters. I think it's a lot of fun.
So fun. Who doesn't want to root for the underdog and just like blow things up sometimes? And like my main character, yeah, she's kind of a same as everybody's, like a badass cybernetic woman, but I made it kind of not so, it was kind of sad, the idea that she actually had to remake her own body with her own hands with scraps from the uplanders, the wealthy. So in my world, this is the Dome City. You can see Central back here. The world is like pretty much uninhabitable. The air is super toxic, and I'm sitting here in Boulder, Colorado right now, where the air quality is 180. It's the worst in the U.S. because of Edmonton fires in Canada are pushing smoke right on top of us. Like, I know what that feels like because I have asthma. I can't go outside. And how awful is that for people who don't have a house, don't have the money to actually have clean air inside their house? So one thing I did in the system was I created a binary of people who had and did not have, the people who are chosen to live in these domed cities around the world, and the people that weren't. And I used an algorithm to decide who genetically was somehow chosen, who gets chosen, and the ticket to live in the dome city. Which is ridiculous, but it also sounds totally plausible. Like, how would we make that decision, right? Like, of course the government would do that. They have so much data on us now. And so to kind of show that contrast, instead of just showing the point of view from a Shiva, from someone who was kicked out and lives in the outskirts and is just waiting to die at like the ripe age of 35 is like the lifespan of people today in this world. I also had someone from the city. So they have this kind of conversation about what is actually happening. And he's like, bootstraps. If only those downlanders just worked harder. If only they just like contributed to society. And then he becomes a downlander and has to kind of face this reality of his world has created this massive divide. And in this universe, the world is given money, or the different provinces are given money by the World Bank for the different technologies that they contribute to society. So it's really fun to show the a kind of underdog character who defies all odds because she has to. She has no choice, but also a character who has decided to kind of go into exile from the upland to become a warrior. And even though he now doesn't belong anywhere, I'm not going to give any book 2 stuff away because it's kind of his journey. But now he's not accepted anywhere in any of the landscape, but he's really believing something finally. And he is now fighting for a future where people get to decide themselves where they are, where they could belong, instead of having a government or Solace, this AI algorithm, decide for them, because that's just nonsense. So yeah, it's fun rooting for the underdogs.
And then my last question, going into more depth about books, is about Mindwalker, but feel free to contribute if you would like to. I wanted to ask in Mindwalker, because you really tackle this idea of like what your main character knows and the ethics of it, like this interplay between not knowing and then what happens if you find out things, and then like how do you ethically decide what you do at that point. So I wanted to know, how do you feel about this idea of information and knowledge in a world where, we often assume that with more technology comes more access to information, but that's often not the case. So I wanted to know how you feel about that and how you kind of walk that line within the Mindwalker universe.
So Mindwalker is the paradigm of information in Mindwalker is very much based on Facebook, because Facebook has taught us exactly what happens when you have access to all the information in the world, but only a very small percentage of it is being funneled specifically to you and targeted specifically to you. And, using all the data that has been collected from your, web presence, you are being targeted with exactly what people who think they can radicalize you think you need to see in order to take a certain stance that they want you to take a stance. And generally speaking, if you have to shove propaganda at people to make them take that stance, it's probably not a stance they would have taken all on their own if given all of the information. And so the Mindwalker world is very much based on that. There is so much information. Everybody's connected, but it's, the corporations are in control, and the corporations can pay to control what information you get. And I mean, we basically live in that world now. It's not that big of a stretch. It's very, very similar. It's just ramped up to 11, because in the Mindwalker world, the companies have basically become the government. The government is a government in name only, but lobbying power is such that, the corporations are basically running things. And Syl, as someone who was inducted into the corporation life at the age of 8, has basically grown up knowing nothing but company propaganda. And this is the thing with both propaganda and law. We've seen over the ages, laws are made by man. Like if we try to define what is ethical based on just simply what is law, then ethics change all the time because people pass laws, and sometimes people are not passing good laws. I think, Claire, you mentioned it's terrifying to watch what's happening in the US right now, because the laws that are being passed are, actively unethical. They are actively seeking to harm people. But, once they're law, people can just point to it and say, well, obviously this is right. It's the law, which is basically the Mindwalker world. Like, why would Syl question her existence when, why would tech corporations be allowed to experiment on children? If it was unethical, there would be a law against it, but it's lawful, therefore it's okay. And it's kind of like, if you grow up around that information and that information only, like, it's kind of hard to break away from that kind of mindset. Why would you doubt what the people who have basically pulled you out of poverty, provided for your family, provided for you, have told you all this time? So obviously, I think, Olivia, just like in your book, Syl is forced to come to face-to-face with someone who is just like, actually, this is not great. If you just opened your eyes a little bit and took a look around, maybe you'll find out that not everything they say is true. And so, yeah, it's a really fun thing to play with, that kind of ethic, because I think we see it in a lot of movies. We see it in everyday life, just how far you can push people into a corner by just controlling the information that they get. And I mean, I guess the polar opposite of that is, some people, even when faced with all of the information, will simply double down or, let be led by hate. So the diversity of the human experience and, the human mind and what, there's a reason a lot of CEOs are psychopaths. When given the choice, they will choose what the rest of us would consider would make a bad decision, but they'll make it anyway because that's what makes money. So, there is no one size fits all when it comes to people because we are all so different and we think differently. And then when you add to that the deluge of information that we are faced with and targeted with, you get all sorts of terrible, terrible things happening. But, when you're writing a sci-fi novel, that's kind of the playground.
I think as just chiming in about the idea of ethics and what to believe today is so super interesting because we're constantly debating what the truth is, what should we believe. I think at the core of humankind after civilization is the idea that there are certain people who know some stuff, and we like those people to tell us the stuff that we should know. They make these rules so that they protect us. In ancient Greece, it was like, don't pee in your neighbor's canal because that doesn't make any sense, and don't do that. It was very simple, and we still have a lot of trust for the people that are producing, and cleaning our water, and like, sure, we want to live without having to think about every single element, and we've kind of given up a lot of this trust to systems that are not very trustworthy. And that's where we've ended up now with this information problem in the world. It's like we don't know what to believe. And I think that we're in this really kind of, we were crossing a Rubicon of sorts into a space where either we will kind of unite behind this disbelief, or we'll find ways to interpret information to understand the truth that matters to us locally on some kind of level. And unfortunately, when we talk about local levels of truth and ethics, then we disregard what actually impacts the rest of the world. So we end up in these global problems. So there's a lot of interesting things to think about. I think a lot of it has to do with our systems of belief and like the core understanding that humanity is basically good, and people do want to help each other, and we do want to live together. I don't think there's any evil anything. I think that there's just so much lack of understanding about how one thing impacts a larger group of people. And I think if we just thought about that instead of like just trusting people on a larger scale, we have to deserve our trust in some kind of way. Yeah.
That actually reminded me something I've been thinking about a lot when it comes to information and truth is that I remember when the internet first started. So I'm showing my age there. I remember the pre-Google times, and we had dial-up and there were blogs, and the base assumption was if it was on the internet, it probably wasn't true, because that's what the internet was. It was email and it was blogs by, John down the street who hasn't talked to a living person in 35 years, but he has a blog that is possibly run by his cat, but he knows what the government is up to. That was what the internet was when it was started. So, you couldn't go into school and be like, oh, I found this source on the internet, because your teacher would be like, it's on the internet. It's probably not true. And at some point, it switched. Now people read something on the internet and assume it's true because they read it on the internet. And that is so incredibly dangerous because there is no more fact checking. There is no more, once my mom was just like, I read this article, you should stop drinking Diet Coke. And I'm like, I should stop drinking Diet Coke, but not because you read this article on a website that was basically a blog that had like 17 names. And I'm like, Mom, this is not a valuable source of information. If you want me to stop drinking Diet Coke, just say so. But yeah, there has been a switch, and I think it's a very dangerous switch. And again, it's a Pandora's box of, once we are here, it's very hard to not be here anymore.
Okay. If anyone has any other questions, please drop them in the chat. One of the questions that we got from earlier, I'm going to scroll back up to it, was, were there any video games, TV, books, etc. that helped inspire your worlds or you? Sorry, wait. that helped inspire your worlds or you used when writing to get in the right headspace for a sci-fi or cyberpunk? Claire, do you want to start? Because you mentioned video games before, and that's like the first thing in the question.
Oh man, so the vibe of my duology is, I would say it's part Borderlands, a little bit of The Expanse, a little bit of Mass Effect, and I definitely use like the Borderlands and Mass Effect soundtracks to get in the headspace, and I know that was one of your potential planned questions. But yeah, Borderlands, Mass Effect, Firefly, The Expanse, Cyberpunk 2077, the video game, didn't come out until shortly after I'd finished developmental edits for the first book, but I really loved the soundtrack of that game, which I used for drafting the second book. And Guardians of the Galaxy, Marvel movies, anything that is colorful and fast-paced was also probably an inspiration. Pacific Rim, another good one.
I was definitely influenced by Pacific Rim. I love mechs. I don't know. I don't have the book for the second book, but there's a big giant mech on my book, and I had so much fun describing this mech because I was like, what would a war mech look like in India? And of course, it would look like this massive god that would just like destroy the world. And it was so fun doing that. But yeah, Pacific Rim was for sure an epic. The biggest influence for me is always going to be Ghost in the Shell, the original, not the other one that we do not discuss. And because it has so many interesting cyberpunk elements, but also elements that are so quiet about the evolution of the human mind, the evolution of the human body. And it's a quiet, small story. It doesn't deal with this big revolution. It's like singular in so many senses of the word, but it's so beautiful. But yeah, for sure, Ghost in the Shell will always be one of my number one movies of all time.
Mine was actually all inspired by nonfiction. So it was a combination of I was reading a book called The Power of Habit, and I was also reading about a process called transcranial magnetic stimulation, which is currently used in treatment of depression and is being explored in habit modification. And I was like, wow, what if we could just get rid of our bad habits overnight? And then the world was actually, I was studying climate change. So it's set 100 years in the future in New York City. And I was thinking about how a place like New York City is going to cope with climate change and how we build civilizations on past civilizations. So I like to think New York City's never gonna go away. I'm a New Yorker. I love my city, and how 100 years from now, if you're in New York City, what will exist and what won't exist, and how will the existing infrastructure be used? And something like our subway tunnels, they're already being flooded. So I imagine that people will use the subway tunnels to still get around, but they'll be flooded, and they'll be people will be sneaking around in boats to try to evade capture and things like that. So it was really thinking about the world we live in now and how that will evolve, whether it's the technology or the climate or the civilization, and really thinking about the science behind it and how that will evolve, and less about current fiction and how that fiction might play into it.
Yeah, for me, it was all the adult cyberpunk stories I love to watch. I watched like Black Mirror, Blade Runner, Altered Carbon, all those themes. I just wanted to present it in a middle grade form for 12-year-olds. So that's how I ended up writing Hannah Shue. But the aesthetics of Hannah Shue are not like super like high tech and glitzy, because actually most of the setting is like in the junkyards. It has a more steampunky feel because my main character like makes like basically she makes automatons. So and then the virtual world, the gaming world they go to is an ancient Chinese fantasy. So that was really like I was thinking like Crouching Tiger, Hidden Dragon world. So it was a real mix of things in my story.
For me, as I've already met. Sorry.
Sorry. I just want to say I love the automatons that your main character makes, Sylvia. They were so adorable and wonderful, and it just I still think about them.
For me, I think inspiration-wise, like I always say this, it's Dark Angel. If you haven't watched it, go watch it. If only because it's Jessica Alba in a lot of leather, and there is nothing like there's functionally that's the best sentence you can say. And if you need more than that, the problem is the show is nowhere, which is really annoying because I can't send people to it. But it's amazing, and it's just a post-apocalyptic world, and it's all kind of like it's actually not cyberpunk. It's like straight dystopian, but it's full of action and it's full of really cool. I don't want to say pseudoscience because I think that has different connotations, but it's like, there's these guys who work for the military and they put an implant on their head and suddenly they're strong and they don't feel any pain. And that is the kind of tech that I love, love, love to play with. It's the stuff that I'm just like, that is cool. I do not know if this will work at all. I think Elon Musk has tried something like this and failed, so it probably doesn't work at all. But it is so much fun. And so that's the kind of stuff I like. So there was Dark Angel, which is basically, I took the Dark Angel world, but I was just like, but what if we made it neon? So that is the aesthetic. And then you have shows like Dollhouse, which I don't know if any of you watched. It's kind of just like, what if we can just blank your brain and put a completely different personality there and then blank it when you're done? And I was just like, that is cool. That is just so much fun. It's horrifying, but it's so much fun. And yeah, it's that kind of tech that I love to play with. And which is why I always say Mindwalker is full of the tech I want. And I know it's horrifying, but that doesn't stop me from wanting it because it's kind of cool at the same time. And I really, really love to play with that dichotomy of this is horrible, but it also lets you change your hair color. So on balance, it's a terrible answer. Oh my God.
Okay, I now have a few rapid response questions. The first one that I'm interested in is, what is a comfort read or watch for you? So I guess if it's comfort, you've probably watched it and or read it over, before. But what do you go to in terms of like media and stuff when you want to be comforted? Serena, do you want to start?
Oh my God, so embarrassing. The Highlander. I'm giving away my age totally, but it's so corny, so good, and the soundtrack is by Queen and is epic. So to not only to watch but to listen to is so good.
I'm not really a rewatcher of shows or books, but the one show I have watched more than 2 times is the Battlestar Galactica reboot.
I think someone already said this, but Pacific Rim. Pacific Rim is just like, it's the perfect movie. It's just perfect. There are giant robots, and there's what's his name? Charlie something doing an accent and not knowing what to do with his hands, but he's also fighting in a giant robot, so it works. And it's just fun. And I want to say it's low stakes. It's not, because monsters are taking over the world, but it's such a gentle sort of monsters are taking over the world, and I'm having such a nice time. Yeah, I think I've watched that movie like 20 times.
On a completely different note from what we discussed today, a movie I probably watch more often than any other has been Tangled. There's just something so freaking charming about that movie and the character dynamics and the aesthetics and everything. I love it. Otherwise, I just really like fast-paced anime, stuff like Pacific Rim and Edge of Tomorrow. Just fun sci-fi is a comfort watch for me.
For me, anything in the Star Wars universe, which I'm so lucky, just like so many people, it's like there's so much content. How many movies have you seen? I could, like most people, I could quote them all. And I love the new content that's coming out. It's super exciting. And then it's super exciting to have an 8-year-old son who I'm watching these things with in order properly and getting him to be like a super nerd with me. Yeah, and anything Buffy. I can also just quote every single episode ever and probably put on a terrible one-person show of just like every Buffy episode. That was like such an epic part of my life. Yeah.
Do you know about the podcast?
Buffy podcast?
There is a Buffy podcast.
Who runs that? I don't know.
I don't even know, but they like watch each episode, and now you gotta. It's great, so good.
I should have thought of that. Like that's such a great idea.
Yeah, I think there was a phase where I had watched Thor Ragnarok so many times that I just started like falling asleep to it, and that would be what I would put on when I needed to go to sleep. And I could wake up and be like, "Oh, I know exactly what has happened when I've been asleep this whole time, napping." Okay, my last rapid question is: if you had to change your title, what would you change it to? Olivia, do you want to go first?
Well, the original title for Rise of the Red Hand was The Children of Without. And I still love that title. And I feel like I didn't actually intend to write cyberpunk. I feel like that's what happened when I tried to write YA sci-fi. It just became cyberpunk because that was what was familiar to me. And The Children of Without is the orphanage that all these children come from that remake their bodies from scraps and things. So I feel like that was my favorite title. Yeah, I would just change it back probably to the original title, but maybe it doesn't fit it anymore anyway. So,
City of Shattered Light was called Winter Dark when it went on submission, and if you've read the first book, you know that Project Winter Dark was an important plot point in the first book. It's a very important piece, and there was a hint of something called Project Echo Fall, which is a big piece of book 2. So I had ideas for a potential trilogy in my head, which was going to be Winter Dark, Echo Fall, Shatterlight. And Shatterlight was originally the name of a very important location that pops up in City of Vicious Night. So one of those 3 titles. And my publisher acquired it, and they were like, "We like Winter Dark, but it sounds kind of fantasy. Can you change it to something more sci-fi?" So my agent and I went back and forth forever. We picked out some titles. So Shatterlight was one of the potential titles, and it became City of Shattered Light. Was what they picked from like a list of 3 titles we sent them. And during this time, I was also talking to my friends as like a focus group, like, which of these do you like better? And one of my friends, his girlfriend had read it, but he hadn't, so he had a basic idea of what it was about. And he was like, "Let's call it Bubblegum Lesbians in Neon Slapland." So that was, I like to say that was almost the title. It wasn't. But then when I changed to City of Shattered Light, I was like, I should make trilogy titles again. So I had City of Shattered Light, City of Burning Dusk, City of Vicious Night. This was acquired as City of Burning Dusk. But then the City of Dusk was also coming out in 2022, and they were like, the author also writes YA. We don't want there to be too much confusion or overlap. Can we do City of Vicious Night instead? So yes, many title changes have happened already.
So Mindwalker was actually always Mindwalker. I don't know. I've had a really good run. I've just hit on titles that have stuck, which I am hoping not to jinx, because basically every project with a title I've had to change has been shelved. And every time I get the title right, they seem to go okay. So I've now assigned that meaning that obviously doesn't exist, but I've assigned it meaning in my head. So that's how it is. But there is a joke in the Mindwalker books that, you know, there's a term in Mindwalker for something called mindjacking, which is, you know, if somebody uses the technology of being able to take over minds for, you know, bad or without consent, which is a huge part of the book. So it's called mindjacking. And there's a joke in the book about how the trolls on anti-tech resistant sites had a little bit of fun changing that JA to a FU. And I think I got the letter right. But if you do the math in your head, it becomes mind fucking, which would sound like a very different book. But it's also really funny to me. So if it wasn't Mindwalker, it could be Mindfucker. But it's a YA book, so I will never be allowed to have it be called that.
That's too funny because my working title was Jacked for Brain Jacked. And my agent, before we went on sub, said, "Oh, that's a little too old and slangy for middle grade." And so the sort of the outcasts in my book do use that still as their lingo. But there was another phrase in my book that I always loved that I wanted to, where she talks about all the tomorrows. So I wanted my book to be all the tomorrows, but that also sounded a little bit more lyrical and wistful than, and you know, basically we went with the middle grade formula of name and, so Hannah Shue and the Ghost Crab Nation.
The person who invented the reinception machine his name is Arlo Genesis. So originally it was called the Genesis machine, which is just too common. It's a little too done. So I'm glad we came up with Reinception. But yeah, it was a little boring. So that was the second. That was the first iteration. But yeah.
Yeah, when people can't remember the second half of that title, then they just search Genesis. They will probably never find the right book.
Exactly.
Anyway, thank you all so much for chatting. Everyone, by the way, everyone's book link is in the description below, so definitely go check them out. To all of the panelists, sorry, not the panelists watching, to all of the viewers who are watching, thank you so much to everyone who was commenting and everyone who had questions. And thank you, of course, to the authors who made this such a fun chat about, yes, anxiety-provoking subjects in some ways.
Thank you so much for having us all.
Thank you.
Yes, thank you.
Thank you. This was great.
Thank you.
Yeah. I hope everyone has a really great rest of your day.
Bye.